Would like to introduce Mr. Sheng Hong, Senior Partner, McKinsey and Company, Shanghai. Mr. Sheng has spent 18 plus years with McKinsey providing services to the clients in a variety of sectors including chemicals, agriculture, oil and gas, power and natural gas. Would like to request Mr. Deepak Mehta and Mr. Sheng Hong to please come on the dais, sir, for this exclusive chat. Would request you to take over, sir.
So it's around 1:30 and we have a competition. The competition is between hunger for food and hunger for knowledge. So all of us in India, I'm sure, are very, very keen to know about what is really happening in China. And I, for one, am equally a keen student of trying to know why China does so well, what is ticking in China. We just saw these numbers in the morning, where India must be now the 4th largest or the 5th largest player in the chemical business. But China, which is the topmost player, is 10 to 12 times bigger. I think Suyog's or somebody's presentation was where India is 6% of what China is. How did this happen? And when did it all really begin? It's a quest for knowledge that I have always been wanting to know. And we have somebody who's been an expert in this world and comes from that world to come and share with us. So can I, Hank, ask you this question that before Mr. Deng came on the stage, China and India were more or less on a similar level. And when did China take off and continue to grow to become the #1 in the world? So what is it that, so far as the chemical industry is concerned, that makes China so much strong and constantly growing?
First, I want to say it's a pleasure for me to be here. I think the last time I was in ICC, maybe 7 years ago, before COVID. And this is the first time I'm back to India after COVID. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm also very excited to see all of you. I'm sorry I'm keeping you away from lunch. But hopefully the conversation here will be interesting for you. So I serve the chemicals industry mostly, both in China but also globally. I think indeed the Chinese chemical industry grew tremendously for the last probably 30, 40 years. There are many reasons we can go through, but I think there was one notion people often comment on China. I think if you say, hey, Chinese chemical industry or any industry, usually the first word that comes to mind, overcapacity. Overcapacity, right? I did prepare, so I was trying to make an interesting notion. If we look at one industry, I think by and large exemplifies the Chinese chemical industry as a whole, is the polyester industry, okay? So if you dial the clock back 24 years, in 2001, the domestic demand is roughly 11 million tons. China has a capacity of 15. It's 40% overcapacity at that time. Now, 5 years later, in 2006, Chinese domestic demand is 22 million tons. So your capacity in 2001 already not sufficient. And the capacity of Chinese polyester fiber in that time, in 2005, is 36, serving 21. You again, almost more than 50% overcapacity. You say it's terrible, right? 50% overcapacity, what do you do? Now you look into 2011. 2011, the demand domestically is 40 million tons. Right? Your capacity in 2006 is exactly roughly 35, 39-ish. So again, you're not enough. Actually, you can play this around for all the industries. We, at one point in time, were talking to a Beijing airport chairman. And he said they extended Beijing airport 3 times, and every time they believe this airport is going to last for 8 or 10 years in terms of capacity. 3 years later, they were short. 3 years later, they were short. So I think there is a notion, if you're looking at this, is I'm a consultant, so I love to ask you to believe every number I spell out. However, I also did an exercise. If you look back in history, forecast always underplays the reality when the market is growing like this. And the forecast always higher than reality when there's a trough. So do not always believe what the forecast is. There is a belief in China is if the economy goes fast, and the number one is the confidence in the economy. Do you have it or not? Right? The demand will always come because people need to wear more clothes. If I can make it available, people will wear it. So that's the confidence number one. I think the confidence number two is more recent, but also extremely interesting, extremely in the private-owned enterprises, where they're much more economic driven. I would call it the first principle approach. What is the first principle approach? Is I don't care what's overcapacity out there, but if the capacity today are not the most competitive that I can possibly imagine, then there's an opportunity for me. For example, everybody sees China builds a lot of crackers, right? But why do they do that? There's so much capacity of cracker out there. Because the notion is very simple. If I build the largest capacity of a cracker, integrated with refinery, in the best location, with the latest technology, using the lowest amount of capex, employ the least amount of people, I don't care. I will always win over time. And I think that's the mindset behind the many private entrepreneurs in China, this hunger, this belief that I potentially could do better because there is an opportunity for us, not only reading into the numbers. I think in many ways, that helped China in many fronts over the years. Of course, you argue, maybe right now, finally, it's actually overbuilt because the economy domestically are not a growth rate anymore. But if you look back in history of the 30 years, that's what happened.
So I had an experience, Raju Bhai Gogri may agree with my experience. We were making nitrochlorobenzenes and maybe about 10,000 ton capacity. We went to China and were meeting one of the producers who was making 100,000 tons. And over coffee, we talked to each other and said, so what's your vision? Like what we talk here in India. So what's your vision? And the gentleman who was also the local governor, government person who was the chairman, he said, vision, we make 100,000 tons. The world demand is 500,000 tons. This gap, we have to fill. I said, there are already 4 Chinese companies making 100,000 tons. So that is 400,000 tons in China. He said, we don't see that, we just see the gap. Now, I want to ask you, how does this mentality come in terms of growth? Why does everybody want to just grow irrespective of whether the demand-supply gap is there or not? Even if you are not following the forecast, why do you then grow?
Right. If you look across many industries, right, I would say the Western industry is very mature. I think earlier you saw Avinash and Chris show you a chart about total return to shareholders. I think behind the unconventional resources in the US, behind the demand in China, there's also the other angle. Why there was like 10 or 15 years the chemical industry works so well is because there's a lot of consolidation. The good part of consolidation is industry will have more economic profit. The unfortunate part is if you consolidate too much, it doesn't have much competition, right? An example, I think, going back to your question is why do they think they potentially could win? I think in roughly the year 2000, China started to produce polyester at scale. I still want to use the polyester industry. At the time, they were importing DuPont technology. Per line is roughly 60,000 tons, a line, a polyester line. And then they continue to innovate on process technology. And they believe, hey, you know, if I focus on it, I could do better. So by the time of 2005, 2010, this gets up to 150 to 200,000 tons. Right now, per line is 300,000 tons, right? One polyester polymerization line. What happens is this continuous, even smaller incremental innovation gave them a lot of competitive strengths. I think that's number one. I think number two in China is the point where capex is very efficient. I understand in India you also have very efficient capex in terms of cost. However, you have a challenge of time. I think if I ask anything in India to improve, I think you need to improve time. In China, we often observe a Chinese build capacity versus, say, a US or Europe build is half the time and half the cost. I think in India, you could do half the cost, but the time is a challenge. And that's where I think the industry, the government, the ecosystem need to get together to be fast. Because when you are fast, you have those incremental innovations and process technologies that give you quick competitive strengths. Right? If you build a plant in 2 to 3 years versus you build a bigger plant in 5 to 10 years, make an entirely difference in your economic.
So talking of capexes, a lot of us in India believe that most of the capexes the government is doling money or giving subsidies, and that's how China is made. Or people, when they put factories, they don't have to pay for the capexes. So long-term loans are there with no interest that we don't know where the money comes from, and that's why the Chinese just keep on putting in capacities. What is really true?
I would say, we also got a lot of those questions. I would say the truth, like everything in life, is somewhere in between. Because you tell me an industry where the news would not say Chinese government subsidize. They will subsidize steel, they will subsidize aluminum, they will subsidize chemicals, they will subsidize cars. So if a government can subsidize everything to make every industry successful, I'm not sure where the government's money coming from, right? So the truth is definitely somewhere in between. So there are a lot of government incentives. And if you go to the very interesting part in China, even though it's a central government, right, with a lot of command and control, the local government competes fiercely for capital. You can actually search this very publicly. If you look at, there's a city called Hefei, who is very famous, made the right decision to attract investment to make EVs. Okay, so there are lists of policies that they gave, right? Interesting, most of them are not direct money. Okay. The first thing they have is government would have connect the car maker to what they call a guidance fund, which is more like a private equity funds. That funds will invest in the factory together as a part of the equity owner, right? But that's the decision between the fund and the car maker, but they have to negotiate on specific terms, so government facilitate that, number one. Number two, yes, they are freelance. They give freelance. What they do is the first 5, they would actually probably build the factory, the civil engineering part of the factory for you, the concrete and the roof. And the government would say, hey, you know, I build a factory, the first 5 years the rent is free. After the first 5 years, you will pay rent, or you can buy it. You can buy it from us, right? Thirdly, they could also do, hey, for the first 3 years, tax-free if you make money. If you don't make money, then it doesn't make any difference. The next 3 years, your tax cut by half, okay? However, if you talk about the real money government injecting into the company, you're talking about maybe a few million RMBs. It's very minimal. Right? The other thing they will do, actually, very important to say, for any regulatory approval, we will expedite yours. That make a huge difference. They will also say, hey, for your factory to run properly, you need to hire international talents. And Chinese tax rate is pretty high. I think similar as India. Marginal is 45. And significant of that tax goes into the local government. They'll say, hey, for your exceptional talents, we'll figure a way to give tax rebate, tax relief for your high talents. We'll also provide some rental relief for the new PhDs. So they do all of this, but very few are direct capital money because the local government actually don't have money, to be honest. Given everything happening in real estate, they don't have much money. On the other hand, I would say most multinational can apply also if you put in the same capital. It's not exclusive to the local Chinese. I think what's the difference in here is the local government in their KPI of stimulating local economy does make a huge difference in terms of the speed of the build. Very recently, you probably all heard about DeepSeek. It's the big thing coming out of Hangzhou. And there was a notion called Hangzhou 6. It's basically 6 startup companies going from artificial intelligence to robotics to game, building consumer-oriented games, the Hangzhou 6. And there was a huge debate, or there is still a huge debate in the Chinese social media and among the government cities. And the debate title is, why didn't we stimulate Hangzhou 6? So Nanjing government actually have this on their internal newspaper. So why didn't we stimulate Hangzhou 6? And if you go through, it's very interesting. It's a lot of government efficiency. The Hangzhou has a notion, any government approval does not take 2 trips, right? But that's only in Hangzhou, not in Shenzhen, not in Shanghai, and definitely not in Beijing, right? So, but that level of, if you say, hey, is that a subsidy? Absolutely. But I don't think that not many direct money subsidy.
Deepankarji, we need to learn some of these things for our country. So, India lost the race in biotech when Hindustan Antibiotics, perhaps the last of the penicillin companies, were finally closed down because of high power costs compared to what China was. But over these last 20 years, China has made tremendous strides in biotechnology, I believe beating out most of the Western countries. So when we come back to finding how come China has so much of capability in technology, capability in research, where does all this come from? And how does academia and industry really work differently compared to what is there in our world or in the Western world? Maybe you could share some light.
Thank you. I happen to serve some players in the bio-industrial sector. I think in China, you would have 2 different bio sectors, or similar probably for the rest of the world. One is very commoditized, like the penicillin of the world, like lysine, like MSG, right? A very commoditized world. And that I would call the old China industrial. More recently, there's an emergence on biotech, the more advanced, especially for pharmaceuticals. Maybe let me start from the old industrial part. Right? So if you look at lysine, not methionine, threonine, MSG, dial the clock 20 years back is mostly entirely multinationals in China, like Ajinomoto, ADM, DSM. But over the last 20 years, the local Chinese capacity has grown so much. Right, and they basically squeeze out everybody else. And right now, I think they're 70–80% of the global supply, the entire China. And you look what they did well. It goes back to some stuff we talk about. But I would say there's one thing that's really remarkable is the entrepreneurial hunger. And I think among all of you, the India industry will have that too. We serve the leading license producer in China. The owner of the company would actually know exactly how to bend my pipe in my plant a few centimeters shorter so I can save a few dollars. Okay? So they went down to that precision and that nuance of cost. And this cascading entirety down to the entire organization. Right? A Western biotech or bioindustrial company will fancy on stable production, they make their money on marketing and sales. I think the Chinese took the other way. They want to make sure their cost is very low, very, very low. So they started from buying corn very efficiently. And in China, corn price is volatile every day, right? So it's almost like a trading business. A Western chemical company in China will never bother with it. But the Chinese local company will say, hey, how do I buy better? How do I beat my corn buying price 5% versus index? It's very simple. You buy when it's lower. So how do you know? I mean, I'm in the industry, I know better than others, right? So they actually could beat that. But that's not the business model of Ajinomoto nor DSM in China. But if you have that already, they give you a 5% margin extra, right? So you can reduce your price by 5%. Right? The other thing they do is, again, this entrepreneurial hunger is, I don't know India, again, so not all the case, but very often, the salesperson would have very little salary. I see that in the US, I have not seen that in Europe. In China, it's not uncommon, the salesperson's salary is 80% from commission, okay? And they will have 5% mandatory attrition every quarter for low performance, right? So China, unfortunately or fortunately, is a place with cutting-through competition. And as a result, if you look at the bio-industrial part, there are probably 10 years of fierce competition, and now the industry is somewhat settled. You have 3 or 4 players, very large. They make a very good profit. But their competitiveness is so ahead of everybody else. How tight they run their plant. It's very hard for others to compete. So that's one part of the bio-industrial side. I think what happened more recently is the R&D side. It's the R&D side. And I think the more interesting part is the universities, the industry, and the government fundings, and everything's kind of work together to build an ecosystem. I'll just say every professor in a Chinese university, their first goal, not all of them, many of them, their first goal is not necessarily to publish more paper. Their first goal is, can I have a startup? Can I have a startup, right? And that's very interesting. In many Chinese universities, the students, they leave the university, they build a startup. I graduated in the US as a PhD. That's not the culture there. I think in India, you probably have a very similar culture. People are much more entrepreneurial. So I would say, going back to your question, I think the big difference is this entrepreneurial hunger, and coupled with the level of support and everything else that stimulates the growth.
One more controversial question. So people in the dye stuff business always feel that when China is doing very well, the Chinese government will be very, very much controlling the environment issues. But if the Chinese country is not doing well, the environmental issues will be relaxed, and more cheap dyes polluting the environment would be produced in China. These are all myths, but you can help us clear some of these.
So I cannot comment on dye specifically, that I'm not a sector I serve deeply. I would say, yes, in the past, environmental was not the biggest issue. Economic growth is the biggest issue. I would say changed tremendously in the last 7 or 8 years, partially because it went to a stage, it was very visible, right? I remember when I first relocated back to Beijing in 2011 from McKinsey, US, there are days I couldn't see the car in front of me, right? It becomes so visible, right? So there's that part of the equation. And so I think since probably 2011, 2012, the environmental regulation gets significantly tightened. The unfortunate part of that is when the Chinese government do things, even out of good intention, they sometimes execute it very badly. So you would have probably weeks or months, they would just order plants to shut down, right? So Beijing has an important meeting with dignity. So I say, hey, all Beijing factory around shut it down, so on blue skies. Right? That has tremendous ripple effect of the industry. But still, I would say, if you look at the Chinese system, you have the central government push, the regional government push. For a number of years, there's a disconnect because the local government's incentives economic growth. So you could have systems where in the daytime, there's nothing emitting. In the evening, people secretly emitting because you can't see, right? It's not so visible. I was just commenting, I think right now it's much, much better. Is it up to the standard to everyone would hope for in a Western world? Probably not yet there, but in many parts it's pretty strict already. And the other part I add is that people also realize it's also a good business because you build an entire environmental protection business out of it.
So how does a country which was supposed to be a communist country become the most capitalist country in the world? That how does one create an ecosystem where there are millions of hungry entrepreneurs who are wanting to grow? Would there be something that is basic to Chinese, or is that something to do like anything the Chinese do would be the biggest in the world, whether it was the Great Wall of China or the Three Gorges Dam? Or is it something to do with the way the government creates an ecosystem where competition thrives and you have hundreds of people trying for something, maybe few succeed, but then it becomes survival of the fittest, as you were saying. So what is it that is really driving this?
It's a very, very good question. It's also, I think, in some way philosophical almost. I would say probably because in a way China came from an extremely centrally controlled economy in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. And people see monopoly or oligopoly is bad because at the time there was no competition among SOEs. I think that probably partially just kind of memory. People remember that period of time. I think the other part, this may happen haphazardly, not by design. Meaning because it was such a centrally controlled economy before, when they opened up gradually. Right? You had the Shenzhen, you had the Shanghai, then gradually inland. So there was always encouraged competition at the provincial and city level. That leads to a cascading down competition of companies in between. So right now, except a few industries, I think the result is, if you look, it's actually extremely pro-competition. Except a few industries, what I mean, like the grid, the pipelines, which the highways, where government views as infrastructure. They want to make sure it's cheap and essentially coordinated. So there's not, there was nobody actually have a monopoly. In terms of a private-owned sector, it's very much state controlled. But then in the majority of the industries, extremely pro-competition, extremely pro-competition. And I think there's something China has, I would say India also has. If I look at why, you have all these newer kind of industry champions out of China. I think there's one thing very unique about Chinese market space. Right now, today, it's the only market that's large enough and fully competitive with good enough infrastructure today. The unfortunate part of the European market is not a single market, right? So the goods doesn't flow that easily. So very difficult. You know, French and Germany, they, you know, it's a lot of trade barriers in between. US is a very large market. However, with the development over so many years, it's not fully competitive anymore. Right? It's a lot of oligopoly in subsectors. You go into a chemical industry in the US, any specific subsector is only 2 or 3 players. Right? In China, you probably easily have 20, 30, if not 100. So a net effect that is the following. So you look at steel industry. US has probably 20 large steel companies. China may have 300. Okay, I'm talking about a few million tons and above. Right? The steel price in China, rebar, is about 40% lower than that of the US. The profit of the industry is only about 10% lower. Because competition breeds efficiency, and they breed leaders. And the net effect, I think people also realize, this is good. Because you say a communist economy was supposedly want to have goods for the mass, for everybody to afford. If you have a full competition, the net result is, I will characterize the Chinese industry today as a consumer surplus industry. What it means is industry as a whole doesn't make a lot of economic profit, where the products are cheap enough for a lot of people to afford. So one reason behind, let's say, the polyester industry, why Chinese grow so fast, because they make shirt cheaper, so people can afford. And I think that's part of the reason behind. I would say why India is a huge single market in a way. Of course, the infrastructure need to catch up. I'm excited to see all the buildings, you know, all this bustling of building bridges outside. Of course, you got a little bit dust and everything. China is exactly the same a few years ago, you know. So I think if anything, the only next one could possibly happen is India.
So in India, we are used to feeling that, say, the SME sector, if competition increases and if companies start to talk about bankruptcy, the government is out in the marketplace to see how to help, how not to have bankruptcy. But as one hears about what is happening in China, the government only encourages competition and accepts that in the process there will be many who will die for few who will succeed. Now, from a socialist point of view, how does that be accepted? Because in India, we always feel that we need to care for the poor, otherwise leaving it to them, that is not the right thing.
Very, very, very good question. I think it's only until recently the healthcare of China is, you know, provided to the mass. Usually, it's actually, I would say that the supporting system of many, right, in China was not actually a socialist in a way. They have basic medical stuff, but it's pretty painful for people to in the past, right now much better, pretty painful for people to get all the different medical support. For example, if I am a migrant worker, come to Shenzhen, the Shenzhen government doesn't pay my medical insurance, okay? Because if that happens, the Shenzhen city will bankrupt. So it has to go through other means. They took a long time to figure out how to do this. But in that process, I would say the China labor force had a lot of sacrifice in this. Right? So it is something, like you said, a balance between many things.
I wonder what a Chinese person would be thinking when we in India talk about China plus one, or when America and Trump starts putting in slapping these huge import duties. China, forget it that China is a country, of course it is, but China is made up of millions of people like you and me. And each individual is facing these challenges from China when they are exporting to the world. So, how do Chinese look at these challenges?
So you ask all the very difficult questions. I think the tariff and the geopolitical thing is definitely on top of many industries' mind. It is not an easy one to solve, right? And also, I think there's also concern, hey, China cannot produce everything and just sell to the whole world. It's just not going to happen. The industry in the other parts of the world also needs to grow. I think the reality, if you look at it over the last 4, 5, 6 years, is overall the Chinese export continued to grow. Last year, China had a record trade surplus. What happened, right? If you look at what the nameplate, right, what's the number you actually show you? The export to the US dropped significantly. The trade with ASEAN, with Mexico, and some of the southern countries increased significantly. You would ask, how much of that trade is actually consumed in the local economy versus eventually rerouted to the US? Right? That is a question. I think the reality is the following is capital intensive and knowledge intensive industry are quite hard to move. It takes a while. If you want to replace all the capex in China that supplies the exports or indirect exports of the fine finished goods, or direct chemical exports, you can do a calculation that you're talking about a tremendous amount of capital. But money is not the big issue. The real issue is time and availability of skilled labor and talents. So that's going to take a while. A long while. And I think what in reality happened is, I think originally people hope China plus one is China and another country directly supplied to Europe or US. These two countries become independent of each other, independent two supply base. Now be a China plus one or plus N. I think in reality what happened is it is China plus one, but China goes to a third party and then goes to there. So you would also argue, is the global supply chain become safer or more riskier? However, I think among all of these dynamics, it is an opportunity for people or for industry in India, in other parts of the world to benefit. I would also argue India has a tremendous advantage in this because the Chinese chemicals industry, if you go in there, the amount of people who can speak English is quite limited. The amount of people who can actually serve their end-use customers outside China is limited. They don't understand. So if you look at Chinese company going abroad, the majority of them, I'm talking about chemicals company, the majority of them are not successful. Right? I think India can play a tremendous role in terms of this connection between goods and customer needs. And with that, you could also build an entire supply chain with it.
So perhaps rather than just being adversaries and competing, there could be a ray of hope that there can be areas where collaborative approach between Chinese and Indian companies could be possible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would argue the main competitor of Indian's chemicals industry, you should not think about China. You should think about yourself. Because you have a tremendous growth demand here. You have 1.4 billion people, more people than China. If you unleash that demand, it's very easy for you to build an industry with it. So the question is not, hey, how do I see China as a competitor? Of course, it is in the near term. I could also argue there are 2 or 3 different things both can benefit. I think the last 30 years of the Chinese industry can serve both as a positive and negative a teacher for people here. There are things that they do probably do well. There are things they did is probably not so well, right? I think the Indian industry can learn from the journey, number one. I think number two, as we talk about, in this entire geopolitical sensitive world, how does different people play different parts? Right. I would also argue, thirdly, that China's strengths as industrial base could also help Indian industry build your capacities faster and more efficient and cheaper. And your objective is not to compete, at least in my view, not to compete on a stagnant global market. Your objective should be how to stimulate the demand of the 1.4 billion people here.
I know now it's already 2 and the hunger for food is equally challenging, but I can only say this last half an hour has been really invigorating, and for a lot of us, the myths that we carry of China are things that we soon realize that China is an ecosystem, but most of the people there or in India are similarly minded and do similar thinkings, except for some reason there is heavy competition that is being supported in China. I know we have Indian examples too. Companies in Hyderabad, for example, in pharmaceuticals, the type of competition that used to be there in making the actives. I saw a company which went backward, integrated into making it the raw materials, making the raw materials for the raw materials. Finally, the boiler that they had, the ash that came out, they started making bricks of the ash, and the R&D center was made from the bricks of the ash that was used for production. You can see the amount of integration. I find similarly, perhaps is this China desire, and perhaps the approach there is also, whatever I do, I want to be number one. And I'm sure besides the learnings in the chemical businesses, we all will be greatly benefited by this inspirational thought that wherever we are, whatever we do, how can we be number one? So thank you, friends, for a good listening. And if there are any questions, do you think we can have one question or two questions?
Only one, sir.
What do you think about the profit level of Chinese company?
It's a very, very, also very good question. I would say, again, the chemical industry is so broad, right? If I just take a broad stroke view, the operating margin of the whole chemicals industry, if you look at overall, is roughly 4% last year. 4%, which means the net profit is probably zero or negative, okay? So that's the whole industry. However, I'll give you different examples. One, in some industry we talk about, like in amino acids, right? The ones the bioindustry talk about. Like in spandex, like in titanium dioxide, like a few industry that went through a few cycles of boom and bust. Well, the industry today is somewhat consolidated. The leading players would have a net profit margin of 10 to 15% and the return on invested capital of 15% and above. So very good, okay? Now if you say, okay, let's look at industry which are suffering of huge overcapacity. The cracker, the petrochemical industry, the polyethylenes, polypropylenes. You would have probably 90% of the players in the market losing money in the last year. But the top 4 players are still very much profitable. Very much profitable. If you look at steel industry, which is the industry, you have negative 1% growth. And you have negative 1% growth over the next many years because the real estate is not going up, right? The industry overall is losing money. the top one player, the top few players are still thinking about building new capacity. Why? Because they're still making a lot of money. The net result is, I'll say, the competition breeds champions. And if you want to, so one thing I'll make a joke. Never invest in industry index fund in China. Only invest in the winner, because the index fund in China always the average, and average can also always be not so good. But invest in the leaders. The leaders makes actually pretty healthy margin.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this unique exclusive chat deserves a standing ovation with a round of applause. Thank you so much, Mr. Deepak Mehta. Thank you so much, Mr. Sheng Hong. I would request Mr. Kamal Nanavati to kindly hand over the token of affection to Mr. Deepak Mehta. To Mr. Sheng Hong. We request for a group photo, sir. And now we are breaking for lunch. We'll resume back by 2:45. We are actually lagging behind.
Can I request all of you to say 3 cheers for Chindia? Not only just China and India, we call it Chindia. What do you think of that?
3 cheers.
3 cheers for Chindia. Thank you, Sheng.
So we'll break for lunch and we'll meet back at 2:45.